Hey guys, so this is the first exercise for today's class on beginners botanical watercolors. I'm going to be doing this smaller here than I will in class just to kind of keep the video short enough. And in this class, we're really going to be looking at a lot of brush technique. So the colors don't matter all that much, although, I'll give some advice over choosing greens, etc. It's more about how we're going to use our brush. So we're going to be using a slanted brush today, as well as a round brush, and then a slightly pointier brush with a pointy top. We'll also use an old watercolor brush. If you're doing this at home, just choose a brush that you don't really like, and a sponge. So instead of dividing this into sections like I've done in some of the other classes, instead we're going to try and put this together in a botanical illustration inspired composition. So we've got 8 different segments that we want to include here in our composition. We're going to be doing it as a bouquet. We're going to arrange these just by using shapes. So I'm going to use this wedge shape to show where we're going to put our first demo. Another wedge shape for the second. 2. So I'm basically just blocking off enough spaces so that each plant gets its own little area, another area. And this is also helpful for thinking about like how do you want things to overlap. It's nice to have a bit of overlap if you want to make it realistic. It's a little bit more challenging, but I think it's worth the challenge. And then I'm going to put circles. So 3, 4, I just need 4 more spaces, and these demos are going to be kind of more circular, so I'll have one over here, one here, 2, 3, and 4. There we go. So we've got our bouquet to start with. I'm going to be making these marks pretty visible on the page, but try to make these marks as lightly as possible. I'll just keep them on here so you can sort of see what I'm doing in the demo, but the goal is not for these marks to be super visible. Right, so let's start with our slanted brush and getting to know how to use this wonderful tool. So have a little bit of scrap paper handy. We're going to start by making some brush strokes in this first wedge by starting with the brush on its side and then seeing what happens when you wave it around. You might get a couple of different effects at this point from one person to the next, so just try using the thin end of the brush and then try applying a little bit more pressure. So we're going to get a couple of windy shapes here. So just moving the brush from side to side. We can get a few more shapes with this brush. So let's change up this green by adding a little bit of yellow ochre to it, going with a slightly different value. This is going to make it more natural. So natural greens have a good amount of red in them. So you always want to add a little bit of red or brown to your greens. And now I'm just going to create a couple of leaves like that. And I'm going to add a little bit more yellow and yellow ochre to that mix. And I'm just going to try using this on its side here. So just make some little like grass fronds. Don't worry about like matching the colors. We're just getting used to using the brush. And I'm moving the brush around in my hand so I'm getting the angle to kind of hit the page where I want it to. It's a little bit awkward at first. But you get the hang of it over time. But it is awkward at first. Now for leaves, when you want to have a leaf that's kind of folded over on itself, you'll start with a shape like this, let it dry. Then what we want to do is start on the outer edge of one side of this bend. Now we're going to cross over onto the other side and cover up that area. So that's going to give us, and this I should have let dry a little bit longer because that is how you get that kind of like two-tone effect, like a leaf is kind of folded over. So it's good to know in class. I'll just let that dry a little bit more. Okay, so that is not all that we can do with this wonderful brush. We can also use it to create all sorts of shapes. So let's make some floral shapes using our carnations as inspiration. So starting by just dipping the side of the brush in the paint, we're going to make some little wavy marks for the petals. So angling the brush around. I've got some yellow on my brush. That wasn't intentional, but that is fine. I'm just going to keep it there. Another way that we can create flowers like this is just use the red paint on the brush. So crimson, red, whatever you have at home. And I'm going to start with the petals closest to me. You want to do as much as you can with single brush strokes. So with watercolors, you really want to limit the amount of brush strokes that you have to put down on your page. And that's where learning good brush technique really is quite valuable, because it limits the amount of brush strokes that you're going to be putting down. As this dries, I can just cut in with more little ridges. Okay, and I don't know what the name of this flower is, but I'm going to make some lavender, because we've also got a few flowers for the class that are really lovely. So I'm just going to dip the tip of the brush into the paint and make a couple of little, like, almost like a three heart shape. So a heart with two little bumps on the top. And then I'm going to make smaller ones going up. Okay, so the next one's called Lifting Out. We're going to move here. I'm going to mix up a kind of orangey red using the vermilion. And we're just going to loosely cover this space. And before the paint has a chance to dry, I'm going to use the side of the brush to lift out the highlight of some rose petals. So lifting that out, lifting this out. And can even do a couple more petals. So let's get one here. Now I'm going to let that dry a little bit before moving back to it. So we'll move on to the next technique, the next flower, still using the same brush. When you're drawing flowers, you really want to think in terms of ovals. So you're going to get a lot of like oval shapes that are all centered around the same vertical axis. This is going to be a narcissus, so we're going to come straight through this oval that I've drawn here, or draw an oval if you don't have one already. The flower will be facing away from us, so what I'm doing here, let me take the exposure down, is I'm making sure that in my oval, one side, the side facing away, is narrower than the one facing towards us. Slightly lower on this axis, I'm going to make a little mark, then move on two sides up, and make an oval in between here. Now you can do this freehand. We'll do a little sketch in class before, but this is just going to kind of show us where to go. Using our angled brush, we'll start by mixing up a very pale yellow, so adding a lot of water to it. And then we're going to dip just the very tip of the brush into the red. Let's start with the back. So putting this down in kind of a wavy line, we're going to go along the back. So we've got that shape there. I'm going to make sure I have enough yellow. and then coming forward to get the front part. So we might need to wait for that to dry a little bit to kind of redefine it. I'm going to pull down the color here. And now I'm going to dip the tip of the brush. So the brush still has a little bit of yellow on it. It's okay if it doesn't have a lot, you don't need to re-dip it in. The tip of the brush is in the yellow ochre. And I'm going to try and make each leaf just by angling my brush to the side. The edges of the oval are where the edges of the leaf, the petal are ending. And this just makes sure that everything is organized around the same point. While we're at it, we can move to our pointy brush. Let me just figure out where I put that. And we're going to use the same kind of principle of the shape of flowers here. So I'm going to wet the brush, and I'm going to mix an orange by using vermilion and yellow ochre together. Clean my brush. Then just dip the tip of the brush in the paint. And let's put these up here. I'm going to start with the petals in the back, making little kind of triangle shapes. So pushing my brush up. You might have to keep dipping your brush in paint to get enough so that just kind of the tip of the brush has the paint on it. And I'm going to do the back of another flower while I wait for this one to dry. And then moving up here. Okay, that needs to dry a little bit more. Okay, we're going to wait for these two to dry before coming back to them. But basically, we're going to be creating layers of petals like this through a technique called glazing. So you let each layer dry, you end up with nice transparent layers. As I wait for this to dry, let's move on to this one where we're going to be using a dropping in technique and doing a pansy. So I'm going to make 5 petals overlapping with the edges being the circle. It's okay that it's overlapping. It'll be slightly transparent, but that's fine. This technique is called dropping in. You're going to want to mix together a purple, or if you have a purple at hand, use that. So I'll use the convenience purple for this. And we're going to, erase the edges here. So the edges of that circle. Not quite sure where I put my eraser, so just going to leave those there. But we're going to wet down one petal at a time on different sides so that they're not touching one to the next. And then use no more than 5 little dots at the end and center of each petal. Okay, maybe a little bit more than 5, but it shouldn't be too many. Maybe 6, let's say 6. Okay, and now I'm just gonna let that dry. Right, which one are we moving on to? Let's switch to our round brush for just a moment and move into this area here. We're going to be using C-shaped brush strokes, and we'll do a peony. So we'll have a little circle within a larger circle. Okay, and we'll want let's use kind of an orange for this. We'll start with a more concentrated color, just putting down a few brush strokes along the side here. Before angling the brush so that we're getting C-shaped brush strokes, leaving a little space in between each one as we move down the flower. As this moves back, these brush strokes are going to become paler, so add a little bit more water to your paint, and thinner. And if the ones in the foreground aren't concentrated enough, you can drop back in some deeper values here. We can also make some lovely leaves with this brush. I'm going to mix a bit of blue into the deep green and then mix some of the orange that I've got lying around my palette into that to get a realistic color. Placing the tip of the brush vertically on the page, I'm going to drag it down, press down, then lift off to make a leaf shape. Sorry, let me move this here. Tip of the brush on the page, press down, lift off to make a leaf shape. And I can do that here. I can also use this brush just to emphasize the curve on this little bit of grass here. Maybe a few more leaves. Okay, and moving on to our sponge. So for this one, let's see. I'm going to use some yellow. And let's get a nice strong yellow here. So I'm going to mix some yellow ochre in with the lemon yellow. I'm going to dip my sponge in that and just dab, and you can think of this as like the pollen at the top of a flower. And then it's also great for getting those little ridges kind of on the side of petals. So I'm pulling this up in kind of a C shape to create petals. We can also use the side of the sponge to get the side of the petals. The key is to mix a lot of this up beforehand. You want your sponge to be dry, but to have a lot of paint at your disposal. And just using the side of the brush to create a couple of petal shapes. All right, then we have one last one, which is my favorite, which is going to be a stamping technique. Now we're going to take this old watercolor brush, dip it in some water, dry it off, and just spread the bristles here. Using either pure or just ever so slightly diluted blue paint. So let me just make some up here actually. It should be fairly thick for this. So you've got this. We're opening those up. We're going to dip the tip of the brush in there and just stamp down on the page. And we want to make these into some lovely little cornflowers. So what I'm going to do next is take my slanted brush back and just add water to it while the paint's wet to make some little petals in the back. So decide which way you want your flower to be facing. And we can use a little bit of card to create the stems here. So I'm going to mix up a nice dark green by putting a good deal of red in there. I'm using a crimson to make a very dark valued green. So adding crimson to green. It's almost a black color. I'm going to dip the side of my card in this paint like this. And then just stamp it down where the stems are. Okay, and now I can move back to our poppy here, because this is dried enough. So I'm gonna wet, oops, that has a little too much green on it. Just wet down with clear water, 2 petals across from one another. Mix a little bit of crimson into that blue to get that purple again, and dot, 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 dot. Get that petal effect. Dot, 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 dot. The key is to wait here for a little bit for the paint to kind of move all the way it's going to go. I still need to wait on this one here for the petals next to it to dry, or they're all going to run into one another. Now that we've let our paint dry a little bit, let's move back to this rose here, which was the dilute crimson. So we're going to come back in with some crimson. And the pattern of light is that, you know, right before you get to these highlights, there's going to be a dark area. So we're kind of looking at the side of a petal. I'm going to start with a darker rose color at the base, then add a little bit of water to its edges to graduate that upwards. So I'm just going along the side of each of these with the tip of my pointy brush, then cleaning my brush, getting a bit of water, graduating that upwards. It's the corners where you get petals meeting, where it's going to be the darkest. I'll come back here with a few more marks. And now that these are a little bit more dry, let's move back here with a more concentrated blue to do the petals closer to us. We can also at this point kind of add some more definition to the base of our tulip. Come in with some blue-green to add some folds to the leaves at the base. So just adding in some green, touch of red, and if we just go over a few sections, it'll make it seem like the leaves are kind of folding inwards. Oh, we can move back here. So let me just clean off my palette a bit, wash my brush, get a little bit of red at the end of my pointy brush. And yeah, okay. just get some petals closer to us. Let's try that again over here. So just like pushing the tip of the brush up. And coming back in. Again, it's ideal if you let it dry first, but that's okay. And let's finally move back here, wet this down, make a bit more of that purple, drop that in. Now, if any of these petals are dry, which they're not really here, but I'll just try this anyway, we can come back in and use the side of the slanted brush to deepen the pattern at the center of the petals, like this. Maybe add a few more leaves. Okay, and then we'll leave it there, but there you have it. That's a variety of styles that we'll be looking at today. Again, we'll be working on a larger scale, so you'll have a little bit more room. But I hope this was helpful, and thank you for watching.